Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Toki N Natural Processed Thailand from Livid Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Livid, based out of Bangkok, Thailand. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Kamwangi, a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And as is usually the case when reviewing a brand new coffee roaster for the first time, I like to review one of their washed and one of their non-washed offerings, with this one being a very interesting non-washed representative, as this is our first time reviewing any Thai-based coffee. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how that came out from a Thai-based coffee roaster, as this right here is day 63. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I actually like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. It is kind of funny, when I picked up this bag, I did take a look at what they have listed as the roast profile for this one, and they have this one listed as a light roast. And then I took a quick look at the Kamwangi, and they have that one listed as a filter roast. But I did mention in our previous review of Livid that they're not necessarily the lightest based coffee roaster out there, as they do remind me a bit more of what you would typically expect from a lot of Asian based coffee roasters that are a little bit more on the middle side of things. And this one was no exception to that, as I did find this coffee to be a bit more on par with that Kenyan coffee, which I identified as being on either the lighter side of that medium or a bit more on the developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 33, first impression. Through the V60, and the coffee was expectedly robust and intense, as it's closer to having a near anaerobic level of fermentiness relative to a natural processed coffee, as it does skew very heavily into the berry sense with an accompanying dark chocolate aspect as well. So I certainly felt, based off of this first impression, that some adjustments were going to be needed, as this was definitely a very intense coffee right from the onset. Day 36 through the Chemex, and there were similar issues this time around, as it's offering more of a near anaerobic level of fermentiness, as the coffee isn't particularly clean, offering a very heavier representation of the berry and chocolate qualities once again. So I'll get a little bit more into that as we continue along these notes, but the first couple of impressions haven't necessarily been the best. Day 39 through the April brewer, and the coffee is still hindered by the overall heaviness and roastiness to it, as it's continuing to remain a bit more reminiscent of a heavier processed natural or even a anaerobic processed coffee in terms of the Ethiopian coffees, with that heavier, darker berry attributes to it and the darker chocolate component. It's been extremely direct and intense from these first couple of impressions, as there hasn't been too much else outside of those two main characteristics that I've taken away from this coffee yet. Day 42 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and it certainly helped demonstrate some of the shortcomings of this coffee, as it does essentially feel like perhaps a lower tier natural processed Ethiopian coffee, as it's not necessarily overly clean or well defined, but rather offering a much more robust and heavy berry forward experience. So that's to say, some of the more heavier processed, natural processed Ethiopian coffees you might have had in the past, where they do just seem to offer those really intense, robust qualities to it, that overbearing berry component, that overbearing chocolate-like component to it. That's what I continue to experience from this coffee. We move on to day 45, as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and that really has not helped this coffee whatsoever, as it's once again closer to being on the more processed side of things in terms of that overall heaviness to it. And in addition to that, there's a bit more smokiness at the tail end of it as well. So a lot of the characteristics that I don't necessarily care for, a lot of the ones that are maybe the more off-putting characteristics for me specifically, relatively robust with a lingering ashy quality to it. So I would say that this was my least favorite day of the coffee up to this moment. Day 48 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee did continue to struggle, as there's little change throughout, offering plenty of intensity and fermentiness with a bit more of a robust and heavier chocolate sense to it. So a lot of consistency, and that's usually the reason why I don't necessarily enjoy reviewing significantly more processed coffees, is because for me, for whatever reason, I feel like they all taste pretty similar to this. They just have that very overbearing, strong berry fruit quality to it, oftentimes much more presented in a red fruit sense, with just an overbearing dark chocolate or heavier chocolate aspect, which reminds me, as I always describe it, as being cherry cordial. And for that reason, I don't necessarily do a very good job of differentiating a lot of the other characteristics of these coffees. And on day 51, we opted for the Chemex, and it was with our standard recipe. And surprisingly, it was the best that it had been to this point, as it has less of the undesirable anaerobic feel and a better defined berry sense to it, with a slightly better and cleaner chocolate-like aspect at the tail end. Still roasty, but better in terms of the overall undesirable qualities for myself personally. And on day 54, we opted for the Chemex, and it's still closer to being perhaps on the slightly better side of a near anaerobic-like experience, as I haven't necessarily mentioned this quality, but this is something that I usually get most specifically from anaerobic natural processed Colombian coffees, and this is kind of olive-like quality to it, as it has that very strong, intense, savory quality to it. And it's been present throughout the entirety of this coffee. I didn't necessarily want to highlight it too much because I know that's off-putting for a lot of people, myself included. But this time around, it does seem to have died down with time, as it's now offering a little bit more of a heavier but better defined chocolate-like attributes to it, and more of the berry aspects in its place. So it's been pretty direct otherwise, but as a result, I've just kind of seen a lot of consistency in terms of the directness of this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick. And that is the finish, level 5. That right there is what I usually identify as being a little bit too overbearing, as the finish in this coffee is one of those that you are tasting for a very extended period of time. And a lot of that is the overall heaviness and fermentiness of this coffee, especially in the berry sense, as it's a lot of those red, darker berry tones to it. I think they have maybe something along the lines of mixed berries on here. I can see that. I can also see a little bit more of those heavier, perfumey, floral aspects to it. But for me, it mostly does skew in that berry sense. But it's going to be interesting when discussing the rest of this tasting wheel, as the sweetness is at a level 4, and part of me wonders if maybe this coffee might have dropped off a little earlier than it might have given when we started reviewing it. We got this coffee around the day 33 mark, and given the profile of this coffee being a little bit more developed, then it's entirely possible that had we started this coffee around the day 14 mark, which is where we would have started this coffee, it probably would have scored a lot higher in a lot of these characteristics. Sweetness might have been one of them, but I think that probably helped get this coffee to a more settled point where it wasn't as overbearing and intense, even with it being a little bit more overbearing and intense based off of our experiences. I think the way to kind of look at the notes that we had for this description of this coffee is it didn't necessarily improve with time. I think a lot of it died down, the overall intensity with time, as this coffee was kind of aging out, which does seem to help for a coffee like this for me specifically. But let's go ahead and move on. Berry fruit level 4. That's another example of it, as it wasn't quite that same extent as it's usually the case when it comes to just extremely heavier processed coffees. So level 4 is not necessarily the worst category it could have scored in, so we'll take that, and we'll go ahead and move on to level 3s, as we have a couple of them. We'll go ahead and start with the stone fruit level 3, and I can't quite recall whether or not they had something along the lines of a plum note listed on here, or something a little bit more in terms of a darker stone fruit component to it, but I did experience that which was a little bit of a redeeming quality to this coffee, as it at least offered something a little different in terms of the just heavier direct attributes of it. Chocolate level 3, that's something I've been going on over and over, as it didn't necessarily dissipate throughout the entirety of it. It was still one of the more intense qualities throughout the entirety of the time that we were working with this coffee. Then in addition to that, the acidity level 3, a little bit more moderate in terms of the brightness, which it can be a little bit of a sticking point when it comes to more processed coffees, as well as it can usually just skew in a, we'll say, uneven sense, which can score it a little higher than that, but level 3 works for me. Same thing with the florality, as I can usually experience a lot of heavier perfumey florals to it, but while they were present, they weren't maybe as intense as they might have been if we had brewed this one a little earlier. And then a couple of other things we're discussing. The body level 2, not necessarily the most amount of texture, but it's been really surprising with both of the Livid coffees that we reviewed. I would have fully expected them both to have maybe a little bit more body than they did, but level 2 is where we opted to put it, a little lighter bodied in general. And then the last two things worth discussing them side by side, of course, that is the cleanliness and the smokiness level 2. Same thing as I mentioned with the Kamwangi, it's not to the extent where I could justify it scoring a little higher at that level 3 mark, though it definitely did have a fair bit of some roasty qualities to it throughout the entirety. But that's where the cleanliness comes into play. That was one of the sticking points for me. When it came to the Kenyan coffee, that was perhaps the only sticking point of that coffee. When it comes to this coffee, it's hit by 2 of the less desirable qualities to it. That's the smokiness, but in addition to that, the very strong heaviness and fermentiness, which did seem to take away from it. That being said, there are coffees I've had in the past that were less clean than this, and I'm mostly thinking of those anaerobic natural processed Colombian coffees, which are just way too overbearing. And I genuinely wonder how this coffee would have turned out had we started working on it earlier, because I could fully see this coffee around that day 40 mark being a little too overbearing and maybe scoring lower in terms of the cleanliness, maybe scoring higher in terms of the berry and sweetness, but level 2 is where we opted to put it, so that's to say it could be worse. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I will start with the positives and the silver lining of this coffee. We got to review our first ever Thai coffee, which I think is pretty cool and unique in that sense, as I do want to branch out and review some more origins that we don't get an opportunity to review that often. And you don't see a lot of Thai coffees out there still to this day, and this is a positive sign that there are some coffee roasters, even if they are Thai-based coffee roasters, that are taking on this origin, and I do hope to see more of them in the future. I imagine a lot of the reason why we don't see washed coffees is because they probably don't turn out well enough, but I think this is one of those coffees that it could appeal to some people, because there are a lot of people that still like these more heavier, intense coffees in general, and I think maybe if you don't necessarily differentiate too much with the qualities of a coffee like this when it comes to these heavier coffees, then this is something that a lot of those people can enjoy in general. I feel like it's a bit of an easier selling point to offer something like this as opposed to a washed Thai coffee, though. For me, truthfully, even if the washed Thai coffee wouldn't have necessarily been the most exciting or intense thing, I still think I might have found a little bit more interest in a coffee like that than something like this, as it was just perhaps skewing a little bit too much in a direction that I don't necessarily enjoy when it comes to these types of coffees. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you do like your slightly more processed, natural Ethiopian coffees. That's kind of the best way I went about this one throughout the entirety, is that it did remind me a little bit closer to maybe an anaerobic natural Ethiopian coffee, and at times a little bit closer to an anaerobic natural Colombian coffee, somewhere in the middle between those two, as it maybe doesn't have too much of those kind of savory olive-like qualities or those extremely strong red fruit qualities of that Colombian coffee, but still enough of those in an Ethiopian sense where you're feeling this coffee throughout the entirety, just a lot of strong, robust characteristics throughout the entirety of it. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Toki N Natural Processed Thailand from Livid Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.